On a freezing winter night, a desperate mother bear with two tiny cubs appeared on a man's doorstep. What happened next will leave you speechless and inspired. The night was bitterly cold, with snow blanketing the dense forest and temperatures plummeting well below freezing. In the heart of this wilderness stood a small, secluded cabin, its windows glowing faintly from the warm fire within. Inside, an elderly man, rugged yet kind-hearted, sat alone in his worn armchair, savoring the solitude that had become his way of life. His evenings were usually quiet, accompanied only by the crackling fire and the occasional howl of the wind. But tonight was different. A strange sound, soft yet persistent, came from outside, breaking the stillness and pulling him to the frosty window. The night was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of his boots on the snow as he cautiously stepped out. The icy wind whipped across his face, but what he saw stopped him cold. There, just a few feet from his porch, stood a bear. Her massive frame was trembling, not from fear but from exhaustion. Snow clung to her fur like a cruel blanket, and her eyes, sunken and pleading, held a quiet desperation that sent a shiver down his spine. At her feet, two tiny cubs huddled together, their fragile bodies barely visible beneath her protective stance. Their whimpers broke the stillness of the night. His breath caught. The mother bear didn't growl, didn't move. She only stared at him, as if begging for mercy. The man's chest tightened. Should he turn back and close the door, or risk everything to help the helpless family before him? He stood frozen at the door, his hand trembling on the handle. The freezing wind howled past him, but all he could hear was the frantic beating of his own heart. Every instinct screamed at him to shut the door, to leave the wild outside where it belonged. But those eyes, the bear's exhausted, pleading eyes, held him captive, telling a story he couldn't ignore. She wasn't just a wild animal. She was a mother fighting to keep her cubs alive. With a shaky breath, he made his decision. Retreating into the cabin, he rummaged through his pantry, grabbing a slab of salted meat and some old bread. He wrapped the food in a cloth and stepped back to the door, his movements slow, deliberate, as though every creak of the wooden floor might shatter the fragile truce between them. He cracked the door open, his breath misting in the icy air, and carefully placed the food on the edge of the porch. The bear didn't move. Her eyes followed his every gesture as he stepped back, slowly raising his hands to show he meant no harm. For a moment, nothing happened. The mother bear stood motionless, her cubs trembling beneath her. Then cautiously, she took a step forward. The man held his breath as she sniffed the air, then the food. Her cubs stayed close, their tiny whimpers breaking the silence. From the shadows of the doorway, he watched, unsure if he'd just made the right choice or the most dangerous mistake of his life. Over the following nights, the bear and her cubs became a familiar sight on his porch. Each time they would approach cautiously, their movements slow and weary. The man noticed the cubs were growing weaker, their tiny frames visibly shivering under the relentless grip of the cold. The mother bear, though still protective, seemed drained, her strength fading with every passing night. Sitting by his window, he couldn't help but feel a pang in his chest. The cubs, huddled together for warmth, reminded him of his old dog, Max, who had passed away years ago. He remembered how Max would curl up in the snow, waiting for him to bring him inside. The memory hit him like a wave, and a deep sense of responsibility overcame him. Determined to do more than just leave food, the man grabbed his tools and began building a small, sturdy shelter near the edge of his cabin. It wasn't much, but it would shield them from the bitter wind and snow. As he worked, he glanced at the bears watching him from a distance, their quiet presence pushing him to work faster. This wasn't just an act of kindness anymore. It was personal. The snowstorm arrived without warning, a raging tempest that blanketed the world in an unrelenting sheet of white. The howling wind rattled the windows of the man's cabin, and the thick snow obscured everything beyond a few feet. For hours he sat by the fire, staring out into the storm, his thoughts consumed by the bear and her cubs. They hadn't returned that night, and as the hours dragged on, a gnawing dread settled in his chest. Had they succumbed to the cold? Were they lost somewhere in the blizzard? Just as he began to lose hope, a faint, desperate cry pierced through the storm. He shot to his feet, his heart pounding. Throwing on his coat, he flung open the door. There they were. The mother bear stood at the edge of his porch, her once mighty frame visibly weakened. The cubs huddled against her, their small bodies trembling uncontrollably. The man's throat tightened as he took in the sight. The mother bear locked eyes with him, her exhaustion clear, but her determination to protect her cubs even clearer. He knew what he had to do. His mind raced with questions. Was this too dangerous? Was he risking his life? But compassion won. "Come on," he whispered, stepping back into his cabin, leaving the door open. Would they trust him enough to enter? With his heart pounding, the man stepped back and motioned toward the open door, his breath visible in the freezing air. The mother bear hesitated, her protective instincts keeping her on high alert. But as the wind howled and the cubs whimpered softly, she made her decision. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped inside, her cubs trailing closely behind. The man guided them toward his storage room, a small but insulated space at the back of the cabin. He quickly laid out some old blankets and hay, creating a makeshift bed. The mother bear curled up, her body instinctively wrapping around her cubs to keep them warm. For the first time in days, they seemed at peace, their tiny breaths slowing as they drifted into a deep sleep. From a safe distance, the man watched the scene, his heart heavy with emotion. They trusted him, and he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. These weren't just wild animals anymore. They were a family, one he couldn't let down. As the snowstorm finally eased, the man opened his cabin door to a dazzling, sunlit landscape. The mother bear and her cubs emerged from the storage room, their once weary forms now livelier. The bear paused and turned toward the man, her deep, intelligent eyes locking with his. Slowly, she dipped her head in what felt like a gesture of gratitude. The cubs, now brimming with energy, tumbled onto the porch, playfully pawing at the snow. One even nudged the man's boot curiously, earning a quiet chuckle. He stood there amazed, feeling a bond of mutual trust that transcended words. As the days grew warmer and the snow began to melt, the mother bear and her cubs returned to the forest. The man watched from his porch as they disappeared into the trees, a bittersweet smile on his face. He still left food near the edge of the woods, hoping they would return one day. The experience had changed him. In showing compassion to a wild creature, he had discovered a connection deeper than words, a bond built on trust and kindness. It reminded him that even the wildest hearts could recognize and respond to care, leaving a lasting imprint on his own. Have you ever witnessed a special bond between humans and animals? Share your story in the comments and subscribe for more heartwarming adventures.